The desert heat was unbearable that August morning in Afghanistan. Dr. Sarah Mitchell wiped sweat from her forehead as she prepared medical supplies in the makeshift field hospital. She had volunteered for this dangerous assignment because someone needed to help the wounded soldiers who couldn't make it back to the main base. The remote outpost was supposed to be secure, but everyone knew that could change in seconds. Sarah was only 26, fresh out of medical school, but she had steady hands and nerves of steel. Her colleagues back home thought she was crazy for coming to such a dangerous place, but she felt called to serve. She had grown up hearing stories about her grandfather who served as a medic in World War II, and she wanted to honor his memory by helping others. The morning started like any other. Sarah was checking on 3 wounded soldiers who had been brought in the night before when she heard the first explosion. The building shook violently and dust rained down from the ceiling. Before anyone could react, gunfire erupted all around them. The Taliban had found their location and launched a surprise attack. Commander Jake Reynolds was leading a patrol nearby when he heard the attack begin. He immediately ordered his team to rush toward the medical station. Jake was 32 years old and had been a Navy SEAL for over a decade. He had seen countless battles, but something about this attack felt different. The enemy seemed more organized and determined than usual. As Jake and his team approached the medical station, they could see that the building was surrounded. The attackers had positioned themselves strategically, making it nearly impossible for anyone to escape. Jake knew that innocent medical personnel were trapped inside, along with wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. Sarah crouched behind an overturned table, trying to shield her patients from the flying bullets. The 3 wounded soldiers were too weak to move, and she refused to abandon them. She could hear the enemy fighters getting closer, their voices growing louder as they advanced toward the building. One of the wounded soldiers, a young private named Tommy, grabbed Sarah's arm. His eyes were filled with fear as he whispered that they should try to run. But Sarah shook her head firmly. She had taken an oath to do no harm and to protect her patients, and she meant every word of it. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room as the attackers tried to force their way inside. Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to think clearly if they were going to survive this nightmare. Outside, Jake was studying the situation carefully. He could see that a direct assault would be too risky and might result in casualties among the people they were trying to save. He needed a different approach, something that would catch the enemy off guard. Jake noticed that there was a small window on the backside of the building that the attackers hadn't seen. If he could create a diversion at the front, he might be able to slip inside and help evacuate the trapped personnel. It was a dangerous plan, but it was their best chance. He radioed his team and explained the strategy. 2 of his men would create noise and movement at the front of the building to draw attention, while Jake would sneak in through the back window. Once inside, he would help get everyone to safety. The plan seemed simple enough, but Jake knew that anything could go wrong in combat. As he prepared to move toward the back of the building, he said a silent prayer. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this time felt different somehow. He had a strange feeling that this mission would change his life forever, though he had no idea how right he was. Jake's team executed the diversion perfectly. The sound of gunfire and explosions at the front of the building drew most of the attackers away from their positions. Jake seized the opportunity and quietly broke through the small rear window, cutting himself on the glass as he squeezed through the narrow opening. Inside the medical station, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from behind. She turned around, expecting to see an enemy fighter, but instead saw a tall American soldier in full combat gear. His uniform was torn and bloody from crawling through the window, but his eyes were alert and focused. Jake quickly identified himself as a Navy SEAL and told Sarah they needed to evacuate immediately. But Sarah pointed to the 3 wounded soldiers who couldn't walk on their own. She insisted that they couldn't leave anyone behind, even though staying meant putting everyone at greater risk. Jake admired her courage, but he knew they had very little time before the attackers would discover his entry point. He quickly assessed the situation and realized they would need to carry the wounded soldiers out one by one. It would require multiple trips, which meant greater exposure to enemy fire. The first wounded soldier was Private Tommy, who had a severe leg injury. Jake carefully lifted him over his shoulder while Sarah gathered the most essential medical supplies. They moved toward the back window, but just as they reached it, they heard voices outside. The enemy had discovered their escape route. Jake immediately changed plans. He led Sarah and Tommy toward a supply closet in the corner of the room, hoping they could hide until the danger passed. But as they moved across the room, a group of armed fighters burst through the front door. Sarah found herself directly in the line of fire. Without thinking, she threw herself in front of Jake and Tommy, just as the attackers opened fire. A bullet grazed her shoulder and she cried out in pain, but she didn't move away from the two men she was protecting. Jake was amazed by Sarah's bravery. Even though she was wounded, she continued to shield Tommy while Jake returned fire at the attackers. Her quick thinking and selfless action had probably saved both their lives, and Jake knew he would never forget this moment. The firefight lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. Jake's superior training and equipment gave him the advantage, and he managed to neutralize the immediate threat. But he knew more enemy fighters would arrive soon, and they needed to get out of the building as quickly as possible. Sarah was bleeding from her shoulder wound, but she insisted on helping with the evacuation. She refused Jake's offer to treat her injury first, saying that the other wounded soldiers needed attention more urgently. Her dedication to her patients impressed Jake even more. Working together, they managed to get all 3 wounded soldiers to the back window. Jake went first, then helped pull each person through to safety. Sarah went last, despite her injury, making sure that everyone else was safe before thinking about herself. Once they were all outside, Jake called for helicopter evacuation. The medical helicopter arrived within 15 minutes, but those were the longest 15 minutes of Jake's life. He kept watching Sarah, who was growing pale from blood loss but continued to tend to the other wounded soldiers. As the helicopter lifted off, Jake looked down at Sarah, who had finally allowed the flight medic to examine her wound. She was conscious and alert, giving instructions about the care needed for each of the other patients. Even in her weakened state, she was completely focused on helping others. Jake realized that he had never met anyone quite like Sarah Mitchell. Her courage under fire was extraordinary, but it was more than that. She had a strength of character that shone through even in the darkest moments. As the helicopter flew toward the main base, Jake found himself thinking that he would very much like to get to know this remarkable woman better. At the main military hospital, Sarah spent 3 days recovering from her shoulder wound and exhaustion. Jake visited her every day, bringing coffee and updates about the soldiers they had rescued together. He learned that Sarah was from a small town in Oregon and had always dreamed of becoming a doctor to help people in need. Sarah was curious about Jake's background too. She discovered that he had grown up in Texas on a ranch and had joined the Navy after college. He had been deployed overseas multiple times, but he had never experienced anything quite like their rescue mission. There was something different about the way they had worked together that day. The hospital staff noticed that Jake seemed to find excuses to walk past Sarah's room throughout the day. When she was cleared for light duty, he offered to show her around the base. They spent hours talking about their families, their dreams, and their experiences in the military. Jake learned that Sarah had turned down several safer assignments to come to Afghanistan. She felt that her skills were needed most in the dangerous areas where other medical personnel were reluctant to serve. Her commitment to helping others, even at personal risk, made Jake respect her even more. Sarah was impressed by Jake's leadership qualities and his genuine care for his team members. She had heard other soldiers talking about how Commander Reynolds always made sure his men got home safely. They respected him not just for his tactical skills, but for his character and integrity. As Sarah's recovery progressed, she and Jake began spending their free time together whenever possible. They would sit outside the medical tent in the evenings, watching the sun set and sharing stories from their past. Jake told her about growing up on the ranch and learning responsibility from a young age. Sarah shared memories of her grandfather and how his war stories had inspired her to serve. Their friendship deepened quickly under the intense circumstances of deployment. They both knew that every day could be their last, which made their conversations more honest and meaningful than typical relationships back home. They talked about their fears, their hopes, and their plans for the future. Jake began to realize that his feelings for Sarah were growing beyond friendship. He had dated other women before, but none of them had understood the demands of military life. Sarah not only understood the challenges, but shared the same commitment to service that drove his own decisions. Sarah found herself looking forward to Jake's visits more than anything else in her day. His presence made her feel safe and understood in a way she had never experienced before. She appreciated his humor, his intelligence, and his unwavering moral compass. 3 weeks after the rescue mission, Jake received orders for a dangerous operation deep in enemy territory. The night before he left, he and Sarah sat together under the stars, both knowing that this mission carried significant risks. Jake wanted to tell Sarah how he felt about her, but he worried that expressing his feelings might add unnecessary pressure to an already difficult situation. Sarah sensed Jake's internal struggle and gently took his hand. She told him that she cared about him deeply and that she would be waiting for him to return safely. She made him promise to be careful and to remember that people were counting on him to come home. Jake promised Sarah that he would return, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. For the first time in his military career, he had something truly precious waiting for him back at base. The thought of seeing Sarah again would help him stay focused and determined during the dangerous mission ahead. The next morning, Jake's team departed before dawn. Sarah watched the helicopter disappear into the gray sky, saying a prayer for his safety. She threw herself into her medical work, treating wounded soldiers and trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong on Jake's mission. Days passed without any communication from Jake's team. Sarah tried to stay positive, but she couldn't help worrying about the man who had become so important to her in such a short time. She had never felt this way about anyone before, and the uncertainty was almost unbearable. On the 7th day, word came that Jake's team had completed their mission successfully and was returning to base. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by excitement about seeing Jake again. She had so much she wanted to tell him about how she felt. Jake's helicopter touched down just as the sun was setting. Sarah was waiting at the landing zone with other medical personnel, ready to treat any injured team members. When Jake stepped off the helicopter, their eyes met across the dusty airfield, and both of them smiled with relief and joy. That evening, Jake found Sarah in the medical tent, finishing her shift. He looked tired from the mission, but his eyes were bright with happiness at being back safely. They walked together to their favorite spot overlooking the desert, where they had shared so many conversations over the past month. Jake finally found the courage to tell Sarah how he felt about her. He explained that during the dangerous mission, thoughts of her had kept him focused and determined to survive. He had realized that what they shared was something special, something worth fighting for and protecting. Sarah felt her heart racing as Jake spoke. She had been hoping to hear these words, but she was also afraid of what they might mean for their future. They were both committed to their military service, and relationships in war zones were complicated and often heartbreaking. Jake understood Sarah's concerns, but he believed that what they had was strong enough to overcome any obstacles. He proposed that they take things one day at a time, supporting each other through their remaining deployment and seeing where their relationship might lead when they returned home. For the next 4 months, Jake and Sarah became inseparable whenever their duties allowed. They supported each other through the stress and danger of deployment, celebrating small victories and comforting each other during difficult times. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Other soldiers on the base began to notice the special connection between the SEAL commander and the dedicated doctor. Some were skeptical about military relationships, but most could see that Jake and Sarah brought out the best in each other. They worked better as a team than either had worked alone. Sarah's medical skills continued to save lives throughout the deployment, while Jake's leadership kept his team safe through numerous dangerous missions. They both earned commendations for their service, but more importantly, they earned the respect and admiration of their fellow soldiers. As their deployment neared its end, Jake and Sarah began making plans for their return to the United States. Jake's next assignment would be at a base in California, while Sarah had been offered a position at a military hospital in the same state. They were both excited about the possibility of continuing their relationship without the constant danger of combat. The night before they were scheduled to leave Afghanistan, Jake and Sarah sat together one last time at their favorite spot. They talked about everything they had experienced together and how much they had both grown during their deployment. Jake told Sarah that meeting her had changed his life in ways he was still discovering. Sarah felt the same way about Jake. She had come to Afghanistan to serve others and honor her grandfather's memory, but she had found something she never expected to find. She had discovered a love that was deep, genuine, and built on shared values and mutual respect. Their last week in Afghanistan was bittersweet. They were excited to return home and start the next chapter of their lives together, but they also felt sad to leave the place where they had met and fallen in love. The desert base had been the setting for the most important relationship of their lives. Jake's team was scheduled to leave 2 days before Sarah's medical unit. The night before his departure, he gave Sarah a letter he had written for her. He asked her not to read it until after he had gone, saying it contained thoughts he wasn't brave enough to speak out loud. The letter told Sarah that she was the strongest, most compassionate person he had ever met. Jake wrote that saving his life during the rescue mission was just the beginning of how she had changed him. Her love had made him a better leader, a better soldier, and a better man. Jake's letter also contained a promise. He wrote that no matter what challenges they might face in the future, he would always remember the courage she had shown that day when bullets were flying around them. He promised to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her love and sacrifice. When Sarah read the letter after Jake's departure, she cried tears of both sadness and joy. She was sad to be apart from him, even temporarily, but she was overjoyed to know that their love was real and lasting. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her pocket, close to her heart, where she would carry it until they were reunited. 2 weeks later, Sarah arrived at the military hospital in San Diego, California. Jake was waiting for her at the airport, holding a bouquet of yellow roses that reminded him of the desert sunsets they had watched together. Seeing him again in civilian clothes felt surreal after months of combat uniforms and military protocol. Their reunion was everything they had hoped for and more. Being together without the constant stress of deployment allowed them to discover new sides of each other. Jake showed Sarah around San Diego, introducing her to his favorite restaurants and beaches. Sarah shared her love of hiking and photography, activities they had never been able to enjoy in Afghanistan. Jake's friends and family were eager to meet the woman who had captured his heart. His parents flew in from Texas within a month of Sarah's arrival. They had heard about Sarah's heroism from Jake's letters, and they were curious to meet the doctor who had saved their son's life and won his love. Sarah was nervous about meeting Jake's family, but her concerns proved unnecessary. His parents immediately welcomed her as one of their own. Jake's mother, Patricia, was particularly impressed by Sarah's dedication to military medicine and her commitment to helping others. She could see why her son had fallen in love with such an exceptional woman. Jake's father, Robert, was a retired Marine who understood the bonds formed in combat. He could see that Jake and Sarah's relationship was built on something deeper than typical romance. They had faced life and death together, and that created a foundation of trust and respect that would last a lifetime. Sarah introduced Jake to her own family when they visited Oregon for Thanksgiving. Her parents had been worried about their daughter's dangerous deployment, but they were grateful to Jake for helping keep her safe. They could see how happy Sarah was with Jake, and that was what mattered most to them. Over the following year, Jake and Sarah built a life together in California. Jake's SEAL duties were demanding, but they were less dangerous than overseas deployment. Sarah thrived in her work at the military hospital, using skills she had developed in Afghanistan to treat wounded veterans returning from combat zones. Their relationship deepened as they shared everyday experiences that had been impossible during deployment. They cooked dinner together, went to movies, visited museums, and took weekend trips along the California coast. These simple pleasures felt precious after the intensity of their wartime romance. Jake began thinking seriously about proposing to Sarah. He had known for months that he wanted to spend his life with her, but he wanted to plan something special that would honor their unique love story. He remembered how Sarah had thrown herself in front of him during the firefight, risking her own life to save his, and he wanted their engagement to reflect that same courage and commitment. Sarah sensed that Jake was planning something important, but she tried not to pressure him about their future. She was happy with their relationship as it was, and she trusted that they would take the next step when the time was right. She had learned patience during her military service, and that patience served her well in love. Jake spent weeks planning the perfect proposal. He wanted to incorporate elements that reflected their shared military service and their love story that had begun in such extraordinary circumstances. He knew that Sarah wasn't interested in flashy displays, but he wanted the proposal to be memorable and meaningful. During their deployment, Sarah had mentioned that her grandfather's military wedding photos were some of her most treasured possessions. She had told Jake about her grandmother, simple but elegant wedding dress, and how she had always dreamed of a wedding that honored military tradition while celebrating love and commitment. Jake decided to propose at the naval base where they both worked. He arranged for a private ceremony in the base chapel, the same type of setting where military couples had exchanged vows for generations. He invited their closest friends and family members to witness the proposal, knowing that Sarah would appreciate having their loved ones present for such an important moment. Jake also arranged for a special surprise that he knew would touch Sarah's heart. He had contacted some of the soldiers they had rescued together in Afghanistan, and several of them had agreed to participate in the proposal via video call. Jake wanted Sarah to see how their actions that day had created lasting positive effects in other people's lives. The evening before the proposal, Jake felt nervous but excited. He had bought a ring that reflected Sarah's practical nature but also her inner beauty. It was elegant but not ostentatious, perfect for a woman who valued substance over appearance. He knew that Sarah would treasure the ring not for its material value, but for what it represented about their love and commitment to each other. On a beautiful Saturday morning in March, Jake told Sarah he had a surprise for her at the base chapel. Sarah thought they were attending a special ceremony for retiring military personnel, which was common at their base. She dressed in her dress, uniform as Jake had suggested, thinking they were honoring fellow service members. When they arrived at the chapel, Sarah was surprised to see their families and closest friends already seated in the pews. Jake's parents had flown in from Texas, and Sarah's parents had driven down from Oregon. Sarah began to suspect that something special was happening, but she wasn't sure what Jake had planned. Jake led Sarah to the front of the chapel, where a military chaplain was waiting with a warm smile. On a large screen behind the altar, a video call was connected, showing the faces of Private Tommy and the other 2 soldiers they had rescued in Afghanistan. Sarah gasped with surprise and joy at seeing the men whose lives they had saved together. Private Tommy spoke first, telling Sarah and Jake how grateful he was for their courage that day. He explained that he had fully recovered from his injuries and was now married with a baby daughter. The other soldiers shared similar stories of how their rescue had allowed them to return home to their families and build meaningful lives. Jake then turned to Sarah and took her hands in his. He spoke about the day they met, when bullets were flying around them and Sarah had risked her life to save his. He told her that her courage in that moment had revealed the depth of her character and the strength of her heart. Jake explained that Sarah had saved him in more ways than one. She had not only protected him from enemy fire, but she had also shown him what true love and partnership could look like. He said that her bravery, compassion, and dedication had made him want to become a better man, worthy of her love and sacrifice. With tears in his eyes, Jake dropped to one knee and pulled out the engagement ring. He told Sarah that he wanted to spend the rest of his life protecting and cherishing her the way she had protected him that day in Afghanistan. He asked her to marry him, promising to love her with the same courage and commitment she had shown him. Sarah was overwhelmed with emotion as she looked at Jake kneeling before her. She thought about their journey together, from that terrifying day in the desert to this perfect moment in the chapel. She realized that their love story had been built on the strongest possible foundation: mutual sacrifice, shared values, and unwavering commitment to each other. Through her tears, Sarah said yes to Jake's proposal. The chapel erupted in cheers and applause from their families and friends, while the soldiers on the video call whistled and shouted their congratulations. Jake slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger and stood to embrace her, both of them crying tears of joy and relief. The chaplain offered a blessing for their engagement, thanking God for bringing them together and asking for continued protection over their love. Sarah's grandfather's military wedding photos had inspired her dreams of this kind of ceremony, and she felt his presence with them as they celebrated this milestone. After the proposal, their families gathered for a celebration dinner at Jake's favorite restaurant overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Stories were shared about Jake and Sarah's courtship, their service in Afghanistan, and their hopes for the future. Both families expressed their joy at gaining new family members who exemplified the best qualities of military service. Jake and Sarah began planning their wedding immediately. Wanting to marry within 6 months while they were both stationed in California, they chose a military wedding with all the traditional elements: the Arch of Swords, dress uniforms, and a reception that honored their service while celebrating their love. On their wedding day 9 months later, Sarah walked down the aisle in her grandmother's vintage wedding dress, which had been carefully preserved and altered to fit perfectly. Jake waited for her at the altar in his dress uniform, surrounded by his SEAL teammates who formed the honor guard. The same chaplain who had witnessed their engagement performed the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Jake and Sarah promised to face whatever challenges life might bring with the same courage they had shown in Afghanistan. They pledged to protect and support each other through deployments, career changes, and all the uncertainties of military life. Their wedding reception featured a surprise video message from all the soldiers they had served with in Afghanistan, including the 3 men whose lives they had saved together. The message reminded everyone present that true love often emerges from acts of service and sacrifice, creating bonds that last a lifetime. Years later, as Jake and Sarah raised their own children and continued their military careers, they would often tell the story of how they met. Their children loved hearing about their parents' courage and how their mother had saved their father's life on the day they first met. It became a family legend that illustrated the power of love born from service to others.